I never thought my dumb curiosity would almost get me killed. Looking back, it's like every single decision I made was begging the universe to screw me over. But I didn't know it back then. I was just another bored idiot messing around on the internet, looking for cheap thrills. You know, the kind of person who reads about scary stuff but doesn't really believe it could happen to them. That's where I started. And, well, where I ended up. You wouldn't believe it if I told you. So, about 6 months ago, I was in a pretty bad place. I'd dropped out of school, couldn't hold a steady job, and was back living in my mom's basement. Classic loser, right? I'd spend most of my days scrolling Reddit, watching YouTube, and occasionally dipping into sketchy parts of the internet when boredom really hit. One night, I stumbled onto this post about the dark web. You've probably seen the kind, people sharing their terrifying experiences, buying fake IDs or whatever. I rolled my eyes at most of it, but something about the way they described the dark web as this lawless, untouchable underworld made me curious. It wasn't hard to figure out how to access it. A couple of YouTube tutorials and a Tor browser later, I was in. At first, it was just a bunch of shady marketplaces and forums that felt like Craigslist on steroids. Guns, drugs, fake passports, you name it, they had it. It was fascinating in a really messed up way, but nothing really jumped out at me as terrifying. I was about to log off when I found a link called The Silence Network. The name intrigued me, so I clicked. It took me to a chat room. The whole vibe was different from the rest of the sites. It wasn't trying to sell anything. Instead, it was filled with threads like how to dispose of evidence or best ways to make someone disappear. I should have bailed right then and there. Normal people don't hang out in places like that. But curiosity, man, it's a killer. I lurked for a while reading the conversations. Most of it was probably fake. People bragging about how they were hitmen or fixers or whatever. But then I saw a thread titled Bounties. It was exactly what it sounded like, people posting offers for services in exchange for Bitcoin. The descriptions were vague, but some of them straight up mentioned things like surveillance, intimidation, and worse. I was half horrified, half fascinated, and then I saw him. A user named ShadowKing88 posted something that sent chills down my spine. Open contracts. Send me names. I'll handle the rest. No price, no details, just that. I don't know why, but I felt like I needed to call this guy out. Maybe it was the way he seemed so detached. Like he wasn't bragging like the others. He was serious. It pissed me off. I thought, what kind of psycho does this? So, in all my genius, I decided to send him a message. I typed out something stupid like, "You're full of it, dude. You're not scaring anyone. You're probably some basement dweller pretending to be tough." I hit send and immediately regretted it. Within seconds, I got a response. Just one word. Name? I froze. My heart was racing, but I wasn't about to back down. So I sent another message. How about yours? Or do you only kill people who can't fight back? This time, there was no immediate reply. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, he responded, "You think this is a game? You want to play? We'll play. Send me your address." I laughed nervously. What a creep, I thought. But there was no way he could actually find me, right? Just to be an idiot, I replied, "Sure, 123 Fake Street." Then I logged off and went to bed feeling smug. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing. I had a text from an unknown number. It said, "Nice try. Check your front door." I shot up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My heart was pounding as I crept upstairs to the front door. When I opened it, my stomach dropped. There was a single Polaroid photo taped to the outside. It was a picture of me, sleeping. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real. Maybe one of my friends was pulling a prank on me. But who? No one knew I'd been on the dark web. And even if they did, how the hell would they get a picture of me sleeping in my own bed? I spent the rest of the day pacing, checking all the windows and doors. I thought about going to the cops, but what could I even say? "Hi, I taunted a guy on the dark web and now I'm scared." Yeah, that'd go over well. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow made me jump. Around 2 a.m. I got another text. "I'm watching." I was done playing games. I grabbed a baseball bat and sat in the living room, waiting for whoever this was to show up. Hours passed and nothing happened. Just when I started to think it was all some elaborate hoax, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, coming from the basement. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house. But I couldn't just leave. What if it really was some maniac? What if they trashed the place, or worse, waited for me to come back? So, gripping the bat like my life depended on it, I slowly made my way downstairs. The basement was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my computer monitor. Everything looked normal. Then I heard it again, the scratching. It was coming from the corner, near the old storage shelves. I stepped closer, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. And that's when I saw it. There was a hole in the wall, small but just big enough for someone to crawl through. On the floor next to it was another Polaroid. This one showed me standing at the top of the basement stairs. I dropped the bat and ran. I didn't even think about grabbing my phone or anything else. I just bolted out the door and into the street, barefoot and in my pajamas. I kept running until I couldn't breathe anymore. Finally, I stopped at a gas station and begged the clerk to let me use his phone. You'd think running out into the street and calling for help would have been the end of it, right? Like once you're out of the house, you're safe. That's what I thought too. Turns out I was dead wrong. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The clerk at the gas station must have thought I was on something. I mean, who wouldn't? A guy showing up barefoot in pajamas, shaking and babbling about photos and someone crawling through his basement wall. He looked at me like I was crazy, but he handed me the phone anyway. I called 911, and as soon as the dispatcher picked up, I spilled everything. Well, most of it. I left out the dark web stuff. I wasn't ready to explain that to the cops. I just told them someone had broken into my house and left photos of me. They said they'd send a patrol car to meet me. While I waited, I sat down in one of those plastic chairs near the coffee machines. My legs were trembling so bad I couldn't stand. The clerk kept giving me side-eye, like he was debating whether to kick me out. Every time the bell over the door rang, I jumped out of my skin. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced Shadow King, or whoever the hell he was going to burst in and finish what he started. About 20 minutes later, 2 cops showed up. I ran out to meet them and started rambling, trying to explain what happened. The older cop, a stocky guy with a permanent scowl, asked if I'd been drinking. I swore up and down that I hadn't, but I could tell he didn't believe me. The younger one seemed a little more sympathetic, but even he had that skeptical look in his eye. They drove me back to my house. When we pulled up, everything looked normal. Too normal. I half expected the windows to be smashed or the door kicked in, but it was like nothing had happened. I unlocked the door and led them inside, feeling this awful mix of dread and humiliation. What if they didn't find anything? What if they thought I was lying? We went straight to the basement. The hole in the wall was still there, but it was empty. No photos, no scratches, no sign of anyone. I swear, I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. I kept telling them, "It was here. I swear there was a photo right here." The older cop gave me this tired look and muttered something about filing a report. I was about to lose it when the younger cop shined his flashlight into the hole. "Hey, Sarge, take a look at this," he said. He reached in and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. My heart stopped. He handed it to me, and I unfolded it with shaking hands. It was a note. 3 words, scrawled in messy, almost childish handwriting. "I'm not done." I felt like I was going to throw up. The older cop looked at me, his scowl deepening. "You got any enemies, kid? Pissed off the wrong person, maybe?" I shook my head. I wanted to tell him everything about the dark web, about Shadow King, but I couldn't get the words out. What was I supposed to say? That I'd been playing internet tough guy and now some psychopath was stalking me. They searched the house and the yard, but they didn't find anything else. The older cop told me to be more careful, and suggested I install some cameras or an alarm system. Then they left, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt like a death trap. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone crawling through that hole in the basement. I locked every door and window, but it didn't make me feel any safer. By morning, I was a wreck. My head was pounding, my hands were shaky, and I hadn't eaten in over 24 hours. But I wasn't about to sit around and wait for whatever was coming next. I packed a bag and went to stay at my friend Nate's place. Nate was one of those chill guys who always seemed to have a joint in one hand and a bag of Doritos in the other. When I showed up on his doorstep looking like I'd been through hell, he didn't ask too many questions. I just told him someone was messing with me and I needed a place to crash. He let me in without hesitation. For the next couple of days, I stayed at Nate's. I didn't go back to my house. Hell, I barely left his couch. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt like I was going to have a heart attack. But for a little while, it was quiet. I started to think maybe it was over. Maybe Shadow King had moved on to some other unlucky idiot. Then, on the third night, I got another text. "Nice try. Running won't help." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I wanted to show Nate, but I was too scared to explain. Before I could even think, another text came through. This one had an attachment. It was a video. I almost didn't open it. Every instinct was screaming at me not to, but curiosity won out, like it always does. I tapped the screen, and the video started playing. It was shaky, like it had been filmed on a phone. At first I couldn't tell what I was looking at. It was just darkness, with faint sounds of breathing and movement. Then the camera panned, and my blood turned to ice. It was Nate's bedroom. The video showed him lying in bed, completely unaware. The camera lingered for a moment, then moved to the door, where a hand reached out and turned the knob. The screen went black after that. I dropped the phone and bolted for Nate's room. I threw open the door, screaming his name. He shot up, looking confused and groggy. "What the hell, dude?" he mumbled. I was about to explain when I noticed something. The window was open. And on the windowsill was another Polaroid. This one was of me, sitting on Nate's couch, staring at my phone. That's when I realized this guy wasn't just messing with me. He was playing a game, and I was losing. I stood there in Nate's room, holding that Polaroid like it was a live grenade. My brain couldn't keep up. I wanted to believe this was some elaborate prank, but every logical part of me knew it wasn't. Someone had been watching me the entire time I was at Nate's house, and I hadn't even noticed.
"What's that?" Nate asked, rubbing his eyes. His voice sounded annoyed, but there was a hint of concern under it. I handed him the Polaroid without saying a word. He squinted at it in the dim light, and his face went pale. "Dude, what the hell is this?" "I don't know," I snapped, pacing the room. My heart was racing, my chest felt tight, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. "It was on the window. He was in here, Nate, while you were sleeping." "Who?" he asked, standing up now. He sounded scared, and Nate never gets scared. He's the guy who shrugs off bar fights and laughs at horror movies. Seeing him freak out made it so much worse. "The guy I told you about. The one who's been messing with me," I said. My voice cracked. "I don't know who he is, but he's watching us." Nate locked the window and pulled the blinds shut, muttering a string of curses under his breath. "All right, man, we need to call the cops." "And tell them what?" I snapped. "That some psycho sent me a picture of you sleeping. They already think I'm crazy. They're not going to do anything." "Well, we can't just sit here and wait for him to show up," Nate was shouting now. "What if he comes back? What if he—" His voice cut off when we heard a noise from the living room. It was faint, but unmistakable. A soft creak, like someone stepping on the floorboards. We both froze. I held up a hand, signaling Nate to stay quiet. Slowly, I crept to the bedroom door and peeked out into the hallway. The house was dark, but I thought I saw a shadow move near the couch. My stomach flipped. Someone was in the house. I turned back to Nate, whispering, "He's here." His eyes widened, and he grabbed the nearest thing he could use as a weapon, a heavy lamp from his nightstand. I had nothing, so I just clenched my fists, like that would do anything against whoever this guy was. We crept down the hallway together, our footsteps as silent as we could make them. When we reached the living room, it was empty. The couch was exactly where I'd left it, my phone still sitting on the coffee table. The only thing out of place was the front door. It was wide open, letting in the cool night air. Nate whispered, "Do you think he's gone?"
I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on something outside. There was a figure standing on the sidewalk, just barely visible under the streetlight. He was tall and thin, dressed in all black, with his face obscured by a hood. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the house. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Nate," I whispered. "He's out there." Nate looked over my shoulder and saw him too. "Holy shit," he muttered. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor. Part of me wanted to run out there and confront him, but the smarter part of me knew that was a terrible idea. This guy wasn't normal. Normal people don't stalk you, break into your house and leave creepy photos. Then, as if he could hear us, the man turned and walked away. He didn't run. He didn't even look back. He just strolled down the street like he didn't have a care in the world. Nate grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here, now." I nodded, and we scrambled to grab our stuff. I didn't even bother packing the bag I'd brought. I just grabbed my phone and wallet and followed Nate out the back door. We got into his car and drove off without a plan, without anywhere to go. We just needed to put as much distance as possible between us and that house. As we drove, I checked my phone. There was another text waiting for me. "Running won't help." I showed it to Nate, and he cursed under his breath. "Who the hell is this guy, man? What does he want?" "I don't know," I admitted. I think he's just messing with me, like it's all a game to him." Nate shook his head, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Well, he picked the wrong people to mess with. We're going to figure this out." We ended up at a cheap motel on the edge of town. It was one of those places that smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke, but it was better than being out in the open. Nate paid for the room in cash, and we didn't give them our real names. It felt paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. Once we were inside, we barricaded the door with a chair and pushed the dresser against the window. It was overkill, but I didn't care. I wasn't about to let that guy get to us. For a while, it was quiet. We sat on the bed, scrolling through our phones, trying to figure out what to do next. Nate suggested calling the cops again, but I told him it wouldn't help. If this guy could break into my house and leave without a trace, he could probably do the same thing anywhere else. The cops weren't going to stop him. Then around 3 a.m., there was a knock on the door. We both froze. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate knock. I grabbed my phone and checked the peephole, but the hallway was empty. My blood ran cold. The knock came again, this time from the window. Nate grabbed the lamp again, holding it like a baseball bat. I crept over to the window, heart pounding, and peeked through the tiny gap between the curtains. There was no one there. "Open it," Nate whispered. "Are you insane?" I hissed. "Just do it. What if it's not him?" I hesitated, but eventually I pulled the curtain aside. The window was cracked open, just enough for someone to slip something through, and there it was, a Polaroid. It showed me and Nate, sitting on the bed in that exact room. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a game anymore. This guy wasn't just trying to scare me. He was telling me there was no escape, and he was right. I stared at the Polaroid in my hand, feeling like I was going to be sick. How the hell had he gotten it? How did he even know where we were? We'd been careful, paid in cash, gave fake names. The realization hit me like a freight train. This guy wasn't just messing with me. He was leagues ahead of anything I could comprehend. He didn't need to follow me. He was already there, everywhere, every step of the way. Nate was pacing the room, muttering curses under his breath. The lamp he'd been clutching earlier was still in his hands, his knuckles white from gripping it so tight. This guy's a freaking ghost or something, man. How does he know where we are? I don't know, I snapped, slamming the Polaroid on the table. My voice was shaking, my hands trembling. I don't know how he's doing any of this, but he's not just playing around anymore. The weight of my words hung in the air like a death sentence. I didn't need to say it out loud. Nate knew what I meant. This guy wasn't just scaring us, he was planning something. We need to leave, Nate said. His voice was firm, but I could hear the fear underneath it. Right now. We'll drive all night if we have to. And go where? I shot back. We can't keep running. He'll just follow us. Then what the hell do you suggest, huh? Just sit here and wait for him to come in and... The sound of glass shattering cut him off. My blood turned to ice. Both of us froze, our eyes darting to the window. The small, grimy pane near the corner of the room was now cracked, a jagged hole in the middle. A rock lay on the floor surrounded by shards of glass, and next to the rock was another Polaroid. This one showed me standing at the window, holding the last Polaroid. It had been taken mere seconds ago. My head started spinning. I backed away from the window, my heart racing, and grabbed Nate's arm. We're leaving, now. We didn't even bother packing. Nate tossed the lamp aside, grabbed the car keys, and we bolted out the door. The hallway was empty, eerily silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow felt alive, every creak of the floorboards made my stomach twist. We made it to the car, and Nate floored it out of the parking lot. The motel disappeared into the distance, but the dread stayed with us. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see another text, another photo. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I pulled it out, and my stomach dropped. It was a live video feed. The camera was shaky, moving through a dimly lit hallway. I recognized it instantly. It was the hallway of the motel we'd just left. The feed showed the door to our room, still slightly ajar. The camera moved closer, then stopped just outside the door. A hand reached out, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The screen went black. "Drive faster," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Nate glanced at me, his face pale, but he didn't ask any questions. He just pressed harder on the gas. We drove for hours, aimlessly, just trying to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever this was. The sun was starting to rise when Nate finally pulled into a rest stop. Neither of us had slept. We hadn't spoken much either. What was there to say? We were out of ideas, out of options. Nate leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his hair. "All right, man," he said, his voice shaky. "We need to figure this out. Who is this guy? Why is he targeting you? Did you piss someone off?" I hesitated. I hadn't told Nate the full story yet. I hadn't told him about the dark web, about Shadow King 88, about my stupid, reckless decision to taunt someone who clearly wasn't messing around. But now I didn't have a choice, so I told him everything. Nate didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. He just stared out the windshield, his jaw clenched. Finally, he turned to me. "You're an idiot, you know that?" "I know," I muttered. "No, like seriously. You're the biggest idiot I've ever met. You go poking around on the dark web, talking crap to some psycho, and now we're both screwed because of it." "I said I know," I snapped, my voice breaking. "You think I don't regret it? You think I don't wish I could take it back? I didn't know this was going to happen, all right?" Nate sighed, rubbing his temples. "All right, fine. What do we do now?" "I don't know," I admitted. Maybe we just go to the cops and tell them everything." Nate shook his head. "The cops can't help us. Not against someone like this. He's not just some random nut job. He's got resources, connections. Hell, for all we know, he could be watching us right now." The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see him standing there, but the parking lot was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed again. Another text. This one was different. Turn around. What the hell? I muttered. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Nate leaned over, reading the message over my shoulder. Don't, he said firmly. It's a trap. But I couldn't help myself. I turned around, peering out the back window. At first I didn't see anything. The highway was empty, just a stretch of asphalt disappearing into the horizon. Then I saw it. A car. It was parked about 50 yards behind us, just barely visible in the distance. I couldn't make out the driver, but I didn't need to. I knew it was him. He's here, I whispered. Nate's face hardened. He grabbed the keys and started the car. All right, let's end this. What are you doing? I asked, panicking. I'm not running anymore, he said, his voice low and determined. If this guy wants to mess with us, let's see how tough he is face to face. Before I could stop him, Nate floored it, driving straight toward the car behind us. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't supposed to happen. The other car didn't move. It just sat there like the driver was daring us to come closer. As we got closer, I started to make out details. A black sedan, tinted windows, no license plate. It looked normal, but something about it felt off. We were less than 20 feet away when the car's headlights suddenly turned on, blinding us. Nate slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a stop. By the time our vision adjusted, the other car was gone. Just gone. The car was gone. Not driving away. Not turning a corner. Just gone. 1 second it was there, headlights blinding us, and the next, nothing. I could still hear the tires screeching in my head, but the highway was empty. What the hell? Nate whispered. His voice was low, almost trembling. For the first time, he didn't sound angry or confident. He sounded scared. I didn't respond. What could I say? My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This guy, whoever he was, wasn't just a stalker. He wasn't just some tech-savvy psycho screwing with us. He was something else entirely. Nate's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his breathing shallow. We need to end this, now. How? I croaked. My throat felt dry and my stomach was in knots. You saw what he just did. He's not normal.
We trap him, Nate said, his voice firm. We stop running and force him to show himself. No more games. I wanted to argue. Every part of me was screaming to keep running, to find some police station, some crowded place where we might be safe. But I could see it in Nate's eyes. He wasn't backing down. And honestly, a part of me was tired of being afraid. All right, I said, barely above a whisper. But if this goes wrong... It won't, Nate interrupted. It can't. We drove to an abandoned construction site Nate remembered from years ago. It was on the outskirts of town, a skeletal building surrounded by weeds and rusted machinery. The perfect place for a showdown, isolated, no one to get in the way. Nate parked the car in the shadows, out of sight from the road. We grabbed what little we had, a flashlight, a crowbar from Nate's trunk, and my phone. It wasn't much, but it felt better than nothing. The plan was simple. Lure him in, corner him, and force him to stop. It sounded stupid even as we said it out loud, but we didn't have any better ideas. Nate used my phone to send a text back to the number that had been tormenting us. All right, you win. We're done running. Meet us at location. Let's settle this. It felt insane to text him, like poking a bear that had already mauled you. But there was no response, no creepy texts, no Polaroids, just silence. Think he'll show? Nate asked, gripping the crowbar tightly. I didn't answer. I was too busy scanning the shadows, every nerve in my body on high alert. The silence was worse than the messages. At least the texts meant he was playing by some twisted set of rules. This was chaos. An hour passed. Then 2. Nothing. Nate started pacing, muttering under his breath about how this guy was all talk. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, we'd scared him off. Then we heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, just a soft crunch of gravel in the distance. But they got louder, closer, each step echoing in the empty construction site. Nate and I froze, our eyes darting toward the source of the sound. And then we saw him. He stepped out of the shadows like he'd been waiting for this moment. Tall, lanky, dressed in black from head to toe. His face was covered by a ski mask, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, judging. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there holding something in his hand. It was small, metallic, and glinted faintly in the moonlight. "Who the hell are you?" Nate shouted, his voice cracking. He raised the crowbar, taking a step forward. "What do you want?" The man tilted his head like he was amused. Then he took a step closer, and another. "Stay back!" Nate yelled, swinging the crowbar in warning. "I'm not afraid to use this!" The man stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the skeletal beams of the unfinished building. Then, without warning, he tossed something at us.
It hit the ground with a metallic clang and rolled to a stop at my feet. I looked down and felt my blood run cold. It was a knife. A hunting knife, to be exact. The blade was serrated, the handle worn like it had been used countless times, and it was covered in something dark, something that looked too much like dried blood. "Is that supposed to scare us?" Nate shouted, but his voice was shaking. He tightened his grip on the crowbar, his knuckles white. "Come closer, I dare you." The man didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. My phone. The one I'd left on the table back at Nate's house. He held it up, his finger hovering over the screen. Then he tapped it. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, my hands trembling, and saw a new text. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could react, the man lunged. He moved faster than I thought possible, closing the distance between us in seconds. Nate swung the crowbar, but the man dodged it effortlessly. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Nate by the arm and twisted, forcing him to drop the crowbar with a yelp of pain. I stood there, frozen, as the man turned to me. His eyes, dark, piercing, were the only part of him I could see through the mask, and they were filled with something I can only describe as hatred. Pure, unrelenting hatred. I didn't even have time to scream before he grabbed me. His grip was like iron, his hands cold and unrelenting. He dragged me toward the shadows, and no matter how much I kicked and fought, I couldn't break free. The last thing I saw before everything went black was Nate, lying on the ground, clutching his arm, shouting my name. I woke up in a dark room. My head was pounding, my wrists and ankles bound with zip ties. The air was damp and musty, and the only light came from a flickering bulb overhead. I wasn't alone. The man was there, standing in the corner, watching me. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to send waves of terror through my body. "Why?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" He stepped closer, pulling something from his pocket. Another Polaroid. He held it up for me to see. It was a picture of Nate. Dead. "I warned you," he said, his voice low and distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "You wanted to play a game. Now, you lose." The last thing I remember before he moved toward me was the sound of the bulb shattering, plunging the room into darkness. And then, nothing.